The mid-afternoon sun blazed over the pristine lawns of Maple Glen, a suburban enclave where everything from the color of mailboxes to the type of annual flowers planted along the sidewalks seemed dictated by an invisible hand. Among its most devout enforcers was Margaret Whitmore, a woman who wore her status like a badge of honor. Known for her perfectly coiffed silver bob and her obsession with keeping the community just so, Margaret was the type of believed rules, written or otherwise, were sacred. Peering through the large bay window of her colonial-style home, Margaret adjusted the tilt of her custom shutters. From the comfort of her temperature-controlled sitting room, she scrutinized her neighborhood with hawk-like precision. Her gaze settled on the house across the street. Number 22, Hawthorne Lane, a property that had recently changed hands. To Margaret's chagrin, the new owner didn't exactly fit the mold of what she considered a Maple Glen resident. It wasn't the house itself that troubled her. No, Julian Carter had kept the place immaculate since moving in 3 months ago. The grass was mowed on schedule, the flower beds free of weeds, and the shutters newly painted. But Margaret couldn't reconcile herself to the sight of Julian himself, a young black man, seemingly single and unapologetically at ease in a place she considered a bastion of tradition. Today, the sight of Julian lounging in his backyard tipped her over the edge. He sat comfortably in a weathered Adirondack chair, a book open on his lap, legs stretched out as though he hadn't a care in the world. Margaret's mouth pinched as she adjusted her pearl necklace. She felt the familiar rise of indignation, a bubbling stew of superiority and fear masquerading as concern for neighborhood standards. "What nerve," she muttered, smoothing the skirt of her floral day dress. Her Siamese cat, Percival, blinked lazily from the sun-warmed windowsill, offering no support. "I didn't move to Maple Glen for this," Margaret hissed at him. "I pay my taxes. I deserve to live in a community of standards." Margaret's hand hovered over her phone. She considered calling the Homeowners Association, but they had already dismissed her earlier complaint about Julian's choice of outdoor furniture. Too subjective, they had said. She considered dialing the police, but hesitated. This wasn't about noise or trespassing. It was about something deeper, more visceral. No, this would require a personal intervention. Margaret squared her shoulders, slid her sunglasses into place, and stepped outside. The sun glinted off her oversized lenses as she marched purposefully across the street. She didn't notice the few neighbors peeking from behind their blinds. She only saw the problem that needed solving. Without so much as a pause at the private property sign posted on Julian's gate, Margaret opened it and strode toward him. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice carrying the same sharp edge she reserved for waiters who brought her salad dressed rather than dry. Julian lowered his book, an anthology on African-American history, and looked up. His brow creased in surprise as he took in the sight of the woman standing on his lawn. "Can I help you?" he asked, polite but wary. Margaret planted her feet as though taking a defensive position in a courtroom. "What do you think you're doing, lounging around like this? Maple Glen is a respectable neighborhood. We don't need this." She gestured vaguely, as if Julian's existence was offensive in itself. "People like you bring down the property values." Julian blinked slowly. He'd dealt with prejudice before, but the raw hostility in Margaret's tone was chilling in its brazenness. He closed his book carefully and set it on the small side table next to him. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I live here." Margaret scoffed. "That's rich. This house was owned by the Petersons for 20 years. Julian nodded. "And I bought it from them, fair and square. If you want proof, the deed's on file with the county." Her lip curled. "I'm calling the police." Julian sighed as Margaret fumbled with her phone. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with righteous indignation. "There's a suspicious person trespassing," she said loudly into the receiver. "He's being aggressive. I'm afraid for my safety." The lie was so bald-faced it would have been laughable if it weren't dangerous. Julian took a deep breath and did what his grandmother always taught him: stay calm. Anger would only feed her narrative. He pulled out his own phone and pressed record. "For the record," Julian said in a measured tone, "this woman, whom I don't know, has entered my property without permission and is making false accusations. My name is Julian Carter, and I live here at 22 Hawthorne Lane." Margaret's ranting intensified, her voice rising in pitch and hysteria as she spun increasingly wild tales about drug dealing and criminal activity. Julian held the phone steady, capturing every word. He thought of his grandmother's stories about the civil rights marches, about dignity in the face of injustice. He wouldn't let Margaret rob him of his peace. And so he waited. The cicadas buzzed in the trees as the sun climbed higher. Minutes later, the squeal of tires announced the arrival of a police cruiser. Two officers stepped out. Officer Kevin Monroe, young and eager, his hand twitching near his holster, and Officer Rachel Delgado, older, steady, and known for her calm approach. Officer Monroe wasted no time. "Sir, we got a report of a suspicious individual," he barked. Officer Delgado raised a hand. "Hang on, Kevin," she said quietly. She turned to Julian. "Can you tell me what's happening here?" Julian explained without a hint of bitterness, showing her his ID and the property deed he kept in a folder by the front door. He then offered his phone, playing back the video of Margaret's tirade. Delgado's jaw tightened as she listened. When the video ended, she turned slowly to Margaret, who was standing stiffly, red-faced but defiant. "Ma'am," Delgado said, her tone suddenly cold, "do you understand filing a false police report is a crime?" Margaret blanched. He was threatening me." "Not according to this footage," Delgado said. "And the neighbors who heard you yelling are backing his account." Margaret's veneer cracked. She sputtered excuses that sounded weaker by the second. "I'm placing you under arrest," Delgado announced, "for trespassing and filing a false report." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut seemed to echo through the street. Margaret's composure dissolved into shrill protests. "This is a mistake. I'm the victim here. He's ruining Maple Glen." But no one moved to support her. The neighbors who had previously turned a blind eye to her behavior now stood in quiet judgment, some filming on their own phones. As Margaret was placed in the back of the cruiser, Julian felt, not victorious, but relieved. Maybe a small measure of justice was possible, after all. Delgado turned back to him. "I'm sorry this happened," she said quietly. "We'll be forwarding this to the district attorney. If you need anything, don't hesitate." Julian thanked her, shaking her hand with quiet dignity. Officer Monroe still seemed uncertain, but followed his partner's lead as they drove Margaret away. Word of Margaret's arrest spread through Maple Glen like wildfire. By evening, the Homeowners Association had convened an emergency meeting. Suddenly, they were very interested in diversity initiatives and anti-discrimination workshops. Several residents, embarrassed by their silence, approached Julian with baked goods and tentative invitations to neighborhood events. He accepted politely, though cautiously. Apologies were easy. Real change took time. Not everyone was willing to change. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid him, and the HOA sent nitpicky violation notices. Julian documented everything, ready to take legal action if necessary. The local news picked up the story, and soon, national outlets followed. Julian's video went viral. Margaret became a symbol of entitlement and racism, another Karen exposed. She lost her job, her social standing, and eventually her marriage. Under pressure, the district attorney filed additional charges, including a hate crime enhancement. At trial, Julian testified with quiet eloquence about the damage done, not just that day, but the accumulation of subtle and overt racism he had endured. The jury convicted Margaret on all counts. Her sentence included community service, mandatory racial sensitivity training, and a public apology. The apology was hollow. Margaret insisted she was the real victim. Few believed her. Julian, meanwhile, became an advocate for racial justice. He spoke at schools, community centers, and conferences. His quiet resistance became a beacon for others, proof that dignity and truth could prevail over ignorance and hate. Maple Glen changed, slowly. Diversity policies were implemented, real conversations about race happened, and some hearts softened. Julian remained, not out of stubbornness, but hope. The meticulously kept lawns of Maple Glen no longer symbolize conformity, but the potential for something better. And Julian? Sometimes he still sat in his backyard, a book in hand. A quiet man who sparked a quiet revolution.